All right, hey everyone, Brian Larson from Beyond the Test. I'm here with George Parablev. We're going to get started in a few minutes. We're just going to hang on a little bit and give people a chance to enter, and we'll be back shortly.
Also, just note, if you are seeing a very pixelated image, just make sure your setting is set to the highest quality. We've noticed some of our preview settings were coming up as 240p. Obviously, you won't be able to read much there. So click the setting button in the right bottom right-hand corner of our video and make sure that your quality is set to high definition.
Okay, so we got a few people coming in now. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I just wanted to let you all know that if you want to have any questions throughout this, we'll be answering them in the chat on the side. So feel free to ask away during the presentation. And if we feel that it's a really good question, we'll also address it on air as well. And try to save your questions, though, if you have major questions to the end, because we'll probably be covering them in this little slideshow here. But if you feel that it's important and relevant to what we're talking about at the time, obviously feel free to chime in. So let's go ahead and get started here. First, we're just going to talk about when you should take the SAT or ACT. Typically, our students take it in their junior year, some at the beginning of their junior year, some at the winter, spring of junior year. There is this exception. Student athletes may take it earlier depending upon the demand of the recruiting school. So, typically you'll have some sophomores taking it there going into their junior year. And the typical timeline, usually you prep at least 3 months in advance of the test. Some students may need more or less. Obviously, it's dependent upon, where you're starting at, what courses you've taken, and we'll be getting a little bit more into that later. All right, so here we're going to look at how many times a student should take the test. On average here, students should take the test 2 to 3 times. The first 2 attempts, we recommend to take about 2 to 4 months apart. And here we've listed the test dates for you just so that you can see them. There's a special note I want to make with the ACT exams. As you'll see, the February ACT exam and the July ACT exam. If you're in New York State, there are no testing centers for those tests. However, if you are a student in New York and you feel the need to take that test, you can take it out of state. But I just figured I would touch on that here.
We should also make the point, this information is readily available. We will also post it up on our website after this. We'll also have this video up from this presentation, so you'll be able to take a look at that as well. All right. So a question we often get is, which test is better for my child or for whomever the student may be? And unfortunately, there's no real clear-cut answer to that. There are many, many different factors that affect this choice, including time management. This is an important one because the ACT is generally regarded as an easier test, but the timing on the ACT is considerably more difficult. So even though, for instance, the reading passages are easier, you have to do them quite a bit faster. And we will actually dig into the timing specifically in our next few slides here. Would be the mathematical background. The SAT does not permit the use of the calculator on some portions of the test. So if you have a student who is very dependent on the calculator or has weak mental math skills, the SAT may prove a bit more difficult. As far as the content on the math, and again, we'll go into more depth here, it's relatively similar. We have found that the SAT does have somewhat more difficult wording on some of its questions. But again, we'll go more in depth here. But we just did want to touch on the calculator dependency aspect of it. Also, the SAT does permit the TI-89 for those students that are familiar with that particular machine. Then we have just a matter of student preference. We've had students who have roughly equivalent results on both tests, don't struggle with the time, don't depend on the calculator, but they may have a preference for the ACT anyway. So that is something that can only really be evaluated once a student takes a few of these tests, and they don't have to necessarily be the official tests. They can just grab a book and practice them themselves. And finally, we have Common Core competency. The SAT is more closely aligned with Common Core standards than the ACT. The ACT is a little bit more closely aligned with just traditional subjects and a little bit probably closer aligned to the material prior to the Common Core. So if you have a child or a student who's really, really struggling with Common Core, the ACT is probably going to be a better choice for them. Again, the best way to find this out is really to have them take a timed practice test with each one. And then you can look up concordance tables, which are tables that correlate the two scores to see which one would fall into a better percentile, which one would be more valued by schools.
All right, thanks, George. So we're going to start talking about some of the differences here between the two tests, and we're going to start talking about the math here. So the math topics are pretty much the same on both the tests. The only real difference here is on the SAT, you're also going to get the statistics part of it. And you do have to be a little bit aware about some of this stuff because the Common Core aspect of the SAT makes the questions a little bit tougher to dissect from the data that they give you. So statistics kind of comes into play there. The calculator usage, as George just talked about, on the SAT, one section you can have the calculator, one section is not allowed. But as George mentioned, the TI-89 is permitted on this test, whereas on the ACT, the TI-89 is not permitted. However, on the ACT, you are allowed to have the calculator for the entire test. So if you have a student that might not be so great at math, at least the ACT, they can depend on the calculator, help them get through a lot of questions, which we see that a lot of students like. The timing aspect is another big thing when you're looking about these two tests. On the math section, the ACT is a little bit tougher on the timing. It's 60 minutes for 60 questions there, so about a minute per question. We've had a lot of students that do struggle to get through the ACT because of that time restraint there. The SAT is a little bit more forgiving. It's 25 minutes for 20 questions in the non-calculator section, and then it's 55 minutes for the 38 questions on the calculator section. So I'm going to let George here talk a little bit more about the English part of this.
All right. So the English and reading skills, we do have an English and writing section on both tests. It should be noted that we're not necessarily talking about the essay here. We'll touch on that later. But specifically the writing, which is a multiple choice grammar / context type of question set. And again, on the ACT, that's called an English section. On the SAT, that is called English and writing or writing and language. So the topics are relatively similar, but on the SAT, we also have using data in writing. So you may end up with a passage that also involves some data, like a table or a graph, and you have to incorporate that into your multiple choice answers. Both tests test punctuation, smooth transitions, sequencing of sentences to create logical flow, word choice. Now, the SAT has a little bit more in the way of word choice and vocabulary. It actually does appear on both the writing and the reading sections. Basically, they're vocabulary and context questions. The ACT also has some word choice questions, but there tend to be less of them. So if you have a student who really struggles with vocabulary, the ACT is probably a better choice. As far as the writing section timing, we don't find too much of a difference in this, even though the ACT does pack more questions. It's 75 questions in 45 minutes, whereas the SAT has 44 questions in 35 minutes, and there's one more passage. The ACT questions tend to be a little bit quicker to answer anyway, because there are more questions on punctuation, and this using data in your writing, couple of questions on the SAT tend to be very time consuming. The reading comprehension section on the ACT, it's 4 passages and 35 minutes for 40 questions. On the SAT, it's 5 passages, 52 questions total, and you do have much more time here, 65 minutes. On the ACT, the order of the passages is the same. You're always going to get a prose fiction or literary narrative piece first, then you'll get social sciences, then humanities, which is kind of arts, and then a natural science passage, which tend to be kind of a little bit more interesting. And they do tend to be a little bit easier than the SAT passages. But again, the timing more than makes up for the difficulty. On the SAT, the order of the passages varies. So you're not always going to get the same style of passage first, and not the same style of passage last. And again, just like on the reading section, you may get some charts, some graphs, which can be a little bit annoying. And in our opinion, they do tend to be a bit more difficult. But again, that's accounted for in the fact that you have a lot more time to answer them. If you look here, you have 65 minutes for 52 questions. So you actually get a bit more than a minute per question. Whereas on the ACT, you really got to move because you have less than a minute per question. Finally, of note, on the ACT, the English and reading sections are 2 separate scores. So if you have a student who's very, very strong in the English, this may benefit them because now these are 2 sections rather than just 1 section. On the SAT, the 2 sections are graded together and you form one collective English reading / writing competency score. So again, if you have a student who's a very good reader, the ACT may be a better choice just because the scores will be doubled. So let's move along here. We have a couple of other differences between the tests. We have the rather difficult and somewhat controversial among students ACT science section, which obviously does not appear on the SAT. We have a 35-minute, 40-question science section, 6 passages with anywhere between 6 and 8 questions on each one. Here's the thing. Section's kind of a misnomer. There's no actual science involved. You don't have to necessarily know physics or chemistry or biology or earth science. You may need to know some very, very basic things like pH levels and things like that, but nothing very difficult. No difficult terminology. Everything you need is in front of you. It's mostly data analysis. So you're looking at graphs and charts and things of that nature. So we've had students who have been exceptional at science in school. In fact, I have a bit of an anecdote. Had a student about 4 or 5 years ago who was actually, as a high school student, published in a medical journal, but could not crack the ACT science section above like a 20 or a 21. In spite of the fact that her other sections were all in the mid-30s. And we've had students who have been very, very weak in chemistry, bio, and physics, but have done exceptionally well in the ACT science section. So we consider this more of an extension of the critical reading than of an actual science knowledge test per se. And finally, we have the essay. Both tests now feature an optional essay. On the former SAT, you actually had to do the essay. You did not have a choice. Now they're optional on both tests. We do recommend students take the essay, but we also do find that not as many schools look at it as significant as they used to. However, your score can't actually be hurt by the essay. In both cases, it's kind of scored separately and not factored into your composite score or your cumulative score. So on the ACT, we have a development of argument based on perspectives given. So what they'll do is the prompt will be something like an argument, 3 perspectives on a question, and then the student has to develop an argument based on one or more of those perspectives, incorporating their own perspective as well. On the SAT, we're actually not presenting an argument, but analyzing an existing one. So it's a long passage, and you have to analyze the argument. And I've made a note here that it's ethos, logos, and pathos. If those words are unfamiliar to your student, that's okay. They're basically just rhetorical terms, and they mean appeal to authority, appeal to logic, and appeal to emotion. Typically, AP English students will be extremely familiar with the type of essay that the SAT features. The timing on both essays is relatively similar. You do have a little more time on the SAT. You have 50 minutes rather than 40. That's mostly because you have to actually read a passage. And finally, we have the scoring scale. Now, this is the scoring scale for the entire test. So the ACT is scored on a 1 through 36 scale, and each section is scored 1 through 36, and the cumulative score is an average of the 4 sections. So we would take all 4 sections, add them up, divide by 4, and then round up. On the SAT, you get a 200 to an 800 on each of the 2 sections. Remember, we said the English and the reading is combined into 1 section score, and then we add those 2 section scores up to get your cumulative score. And as I noted earlier, the essay is scored separately on both exams. So if you have a student who's particularly weak at math, it's easier to hide that on an ACT because you have 3 other sections to average that out with. On the SAT, you only have 1 other section, which you will be adding to that score. Granted, that's not necessarily a solution. If you have somebody who's weak at math, they should probably work to improve that math on both tests, but it is a little bit easier to hide on the ACT. And I'll let Brian take a look at the next slide here, which is going to involve how schools perceive these 2 tests.
All right, so here we want to look at, do schools look at both tests equally? And the answer is, for the most part, yes, the schools value the 2 tests equally. Most schools will accept either or. However, you do want to check with the colleges that you're applying to make sure that they do take whichever test you're signed up for. Also, there are concordance tables that allow students to correlate their scores on from one test to another. I think we talked about this earlier. You can also find that. I think we have it posted on our website.
Under the About Us in the
useful
links section.
Right. So you can find it there. That's on beyondthetest.com, the About Us, and useful links. You'll find more information. So let's kind of talk about student performance on this test here. So student performance. So as we said before, the SAT has a lot of Common Core stuff on it. Actually, the guy who heads up the Common Core was put in charge of redesigning the new SAT that they just released. So you will see a lot of Common Core questions on that. So if a student's brought up in a school setting that has Common Core and is used to Common Core, they might fare better with that kind of wording on the test. Also, some things to consider for student performance: calculator dependency. If you have a student that isn't so strong in math, the ACT is probably the better test only because they can rely on their calculator throughout the entire thing. Where on the SAT, as we mentioned, 1 section of the math you're allowed the calculator and 1 section you're not. The timing issues. We mentioned, on the ACT, the math section, you have about 1 minute per question. The SAT is a little bit more forgiving, and that pretty much holds true, I believe, for most sections.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. Conceptual understanding of math can cause some things to happen here. Critical thinking and data analysis. So again, this kind of ties a little bit more back to the Common Core as well. The SAT is going to require a lot more critical thinking, where you have to, if you're for the math section, if you're solving for one thing, that's not necessarily the answer on the SAT. They might want you to take that answer and then apply it to another scenario to come up with the answer. Whereas the ACT, it's a little bit more straightforward, where the question's asking what you'll get.
Yeah, to be clear, what we're talking about here is a question we get quite a bit, and that's why does my A+ student struggle on these standardized exams? So these are not just for a specific exam, but these are in general with respect to standardized testing. And the conceptual understanding of math, for instance, what we mean by that is when students take a math test in school, they can effectively study the week or two worth of math material and just repeat it and then forget about it until the final. The ACT and SAT are cumulative tests spanning several years of math. So somebody who does not have a strong conceptual understanding of math may be a good studier and still be getting 90s plus across the board on their math, but may not necessarily recall the concepts later when needed.
Right, and that's the same thing later on here. You see that some student performance, the stress and testing anxiety at the bottom, some students just don't handle testing well, which is another reason why they might lack or not perform as well, even though they are one of those 90+ students in school. But obviously there are certain tricks and strategies that you can learn that kind of help out a little bit more to make the test easier for the students. And then we have the scoring here. So I'll talk a little bit about this here. The average scores on the SAT is 1,000 and the ACT is a 21. So the SAT here and the ACT, and I mean, there's not much to talk about really with that. But both tests are graded on a curve. So some tests might be harder than others, but they all even out based off of that curve.
Right. So we're basically the objective is to compete against the other students for that particular test. So we can reasonably expect a student who would score in the, say, 70th percentile on one test to do roughly the same on another test. So we do occasionally get the question, oh, I've heard, the October test is easier, or the October test is harder, or the January test is harder. And I'm not sure where anybody's hearing this, because all of the scores, all of the tests, even though they may be harder or easier, first of all, they're harder and easier at random. And second of all, the curve will adjust for all of that as well.
Yeah. And the nice thing about these tests too is they show you the percentile scores, which will show you a student's rank amongst their peers. So, if a student scores in the 89th percentile, you'll see that he scored higher than 89% of the students who took the test. Also, a little bit about receiving the results. The SAT, generally, you'll see it takes about 4 to 6 weeks from the test date to get the results back, where the ACT has a nice quick turnaround of about 10 days from the test date. The last thing here that I just want to mention is super scoring. We do get asked about that. Some people have never even heard the term super score before. But what some colleges will do, and again, this is dependent upon the college, so you'll want to make sure that they find out if they do this or not. But I think most colleges do it now.
It's a little bit more common with the SAT than it is with the ACT. We found that most schools do super score the SAT. Not nearly as many super score the ACT, but again, this is something you'll want to contact the admissions office at your school, at the college. Also, a lot of this information is readily available by just Googling it. You can find all of these lists of schools that super score versus not.
And what super scoring actually does here is the super scoring will take, so say you take the test multiple times, it will take your best section from different tests and combine them together to give you a super score or best score achieved from all of it here.
So in that sense, a student that had never scored who had scored a 31 on all 4 tests that they took, for instance, on an ACT, may actually produce a super score of a 33 because their best sections on each test were different. And again, the ACT not as frequently super scored. And again, finally, the final word on that goes to the admissions office of a particular college. So we have one other topic here, and that's the SAT subject tests, which are pretty frequently misunderstood. They have nothing to do with either of the other 2 tests. What they are short 1-hour tests that can be taken to demonstrate competency in a specific subject area. So you'll have an SAT subject test in Math Level 1, Math Level 2, Physics, many different languages. and things of that nature. And the idea here is that they should be taken immediately after completion of the course. If you have a student who has taken AP Biology this year, have them take the SAT-2 in biology at the end of the year. Now, that's not necessarily always the case with the math. The math, you can kind of play around with it and take it later at almost any given time. But as far as specific subjects, things that require a lot of material learning, there's no reason to wait. You can have students in the 9th or the 10th grade be taking these tests in the fall, especially if, in the spring, especially if they've taken an AP course. That type of information tends to be forgotten over a summer. So the spring, like the March or the May or the June exam, tend to be the best times to take that, preferably the June. They are administered on the same day as the SAT. So you cannot take both an SAT and a subject test on the same day, but you may take up to 3 subject tests. So if you have multiple AP classes this year that correlate to an SAT-2, then take all of them in the same day. And of course, you'd have to adjust your SAT or ACT testing schedule accordingly. And as far as college requirements, some colleges require 1 to 2 subject tests. There are not all that many of them. And again, we advise contacting admissions at the colleges of interest for the final word on that. Either way, even if it's not a requirement, a good score in an SAT-2 will certainly be very helpful on an application. So I think that about wraps us up here. So we are Beyond the Test. You can check us out at www.beyondthetest.com. You can also click subscribe under our video and check out some of the other videos we've published. We do publish some videos on SAT and ACT strategies, as well as some other math, physics, and some other educational videos that are pretty useful. We are happy to answer any questions in the chat. We'll be hanging around for a little bit longer here to answer those. Certainly, you may also contact us at beyondthetest@gmail.com or the phone number listed here, 856-240-0728. It's 2400 SAT. Yeah, unfortunately, we got that number before they changed back to the 1600 score. So there's that. We hope you found this this lecture helpful. We hope you've learned something new. And again, we'll be happy to answer any additional questions while we're here.
Yeah, and make sure, if you haven't already, check out the website. Like we were mentioning earlier, we do have that useful links up there. You'll find a lot of good resources there, concordance tables. You'll be able to sign up for your test, or there'll be links to sign up for each test on that same page right there. And there's a lot of good, useful information. So check that out. We hope we've been helpful here today. Again, we'll be sticking around and answering any questions in the YouTube comments or chat on the side. And
finally, we'll also be posting, if you missed any part of this video and you want to rewatch it, this will be published on our YouTube channel after the completion here as well. So thank you very much for tuning in. Have a great evening, and we hope we've been helpful for you.